Hello and welcome to a very special edition of Inside. And today we're going to be discussing an issue that should in fact be talked about a lot more in all mediums. And that is with respect to climate change as well as global warming. And India over the years has acquired a central position in many ways in directing and dictating the discourse when it comes to this very pressing issue of climate change, which has implications for the state of our economy and also our lives and the generations to take this discourse forward as well. And who better to explain to us that the challenges that the country faces as well as the likely policies that might evolve over a period of time. And we have Mr. Jayant Sinha, Member of Parliament from Hazaribagh in Jharkhand, also the Chairman of the Standing Committee on Finance, and somebody who's been very closely involved in deliberations with respect to the kind of steps that India actually needs to take to going forward with respect to evolving a comprehensive blueprint to address the issue of climate change. So, Mr. Sinha, we are here today to talk about net zero, which is a target that we've set for the year 2070. Many people would ask, what actually are we talking about when we discuss net zero? What does it entail in terms of certain policy interventions that might have to be made? And what are the steps that we've been taking as a country and also as a government in order to address this very serious issue of climate change?
Thank you very much, Siddharth, and wonderful to be with you and with your audience today. I want to thank you for doing this very, very important show, because climate change has to be a very, very high priority for everything that we do. And of course, as you know, the Honourable Prime Minister has issued an announcement that we as India want to get to net zero, will get to net zero, and have to get to net zero by 2070. So what does that mean, and what is the implication of getting to net zero? And I will first of all start off by saying that net zero actually will be very, very net positive for India. But we need to understand first and foremost what is net zero. Okay. And to do that, we need to understand global warming, and we need to understand how greenhouse gases actually lead to global warming. So the sun heats up the planet, right? So the solar radiation coming from the sun is heating up the planet all the time. The sun's radiation, as you can see from this terrific graphic, yes, hit the earth, and much of the sun's energy is then reflected back off into space. But what happens is that when greenhouse gases build up in the atmosphere, the sun's radiation, which is escaping the earth by reflecting off the earth, gets trapped in the earth. And so think of it as in a cold winter's night when you take a blanket and you have a blanket around you. Because you have a blanket, you feel warm inside the blanket. So greenhouse gases are creating a blanket around the earth and gradually heating up the earth. And that is basically what is happening. The radiation does not leave the planet, and the planet starts to get warmer and warmer and warmer. And that's global warming.
So you've explained to us the phenomenon of global warming in a nutshell, but in the next slide we'll actually explain how alarming the situation actually is. So if you could actually take us through the CO2 levels which have gone beyond control, as some would say.
Yes, you're exactly right, Siddharth. And what has happened, of course, is that carbon dioxide, CO2, is the most important greenhouse gas. There are other greenhouse gases as well, like methane, but the most important greenhouse gas is carbon. And what happens with carbon dioxide is when we use fossil fuels, when we use coal, when we use petrol, when we use diesel, we create carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide builds up in the atmosphere. So here you can see over the last 800 years what has been happening. The levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have been largely under 300 parts per million. They have largely been under 300 parts per million. But what has happened is in the last 150 years, as we've started to use fossil fuels, coal, petrol, diesel for energy, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has started to skyrocket, and it has crossed 421 parts per million. This is a very big red flag for us.
So we've actually dwelt on how bad the situation currently is. Let's crystal ball gaze into the future and see where we might reach in 2100, because that's our next projection. And if you could just turn to the next slide, this is how the situation might actually deteriorate, Mr. Sinha, come 2100. So that is, of course, something that spells alarm bells for our generation and future generations too.
Siddharth, this is the slide that all of you as young people have to be very worried about. I won't be around in 2100, but you will certainly be around and your generation will certainly be around in 2100. So right now, the world is emitting about 59 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's what the world is emitting. We have to get to net zero. This is the green line. We've got to bring it down to net zero as quickly as possible. Okay. Certainly by 2050, 2060, 2100, we have to bring it down. Unfortunately, and this is the work of hundreds and hundreds of scientists that have been collaborating now for 25 years on what is likely to happen in the future. Many very complicated scientific studies, many technical simulations, much research has gone into this. And the United Nations Environment Programme and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, have been working on what the projections for the future will be like. And there are various scenarios. But right now, the important point that all of you as young people need to understand is that the best guess, and these are guesses after all, because these are simulations, we can't really know for 100% accuracy. The best guess is with today's policies, Siddharth, with today's policies, we are in a situation where, according to the United Nations Environment Programme, certainly we'll be between 2.6 to 2.9 degrees centigrade of a warmer Earth, but most likely we'll be at 2.8 degrees centigrade increase of global average mean temperatures. Okay. But here's the rub. This global average mean temperatures includes oceans, which of course, as you know, are 2/3 of the planet. 1/3 of the planet is land. So when the entire planet warms up by 2.8 degrees centigrade, land, which is after all where we live, we don't live on the ocean, land is going to warm much more quickly. So instead of 2.8 degrees centigrade, we may be at 3 or 4 degrees centigrade warmer on land.
And what this has also meant, Mr. Sinha, and that takes us to our next slide, is that we've already been witness to certain extreme weather events. That has also meant that 85% of Indians are at risk. It also means that 95% of our coastal districts are likely hotspots, and that rupees 6 lakh crore is already the cost that has been incurred as a result of this phenomenon.
Yes, you're exactly right. Now let me speak as an engineer, Siddharth. So what happens is that when the earth warms, you're pumping more energy into our climate system. You're pumping more energy into our climate system. It gets hotter, which is why we have the droughts, and that's why lots of Indians are at risk. But not only is it getting hotter, there's more energy in our cyclones. There's more energy in our thunderstorms. There's more energy in the hurricanes that we are seeing around the world. And because there's more energy, we are seeing much larger storms. We never used to have cyclones in the Arabian Sea. We had them in the Bay of Bengal, which is much more enclosed. Yeah. It gets warmer and there's more energy there. But now as the oceans are warming, we are getting cyclones in the Arabian Sea as well, right?
There were 2 successive cyclones in 2020 and 2021 in Mumbai.
Exactly, exactly. So we are going to see more cyclones, and the cyclones that have already come, whether they were in Kolkata, in Odisha, in Mumbai, in Gujarat, they have already caused 6 lakh crores of damage. So extreme weather, because of the heating that has already happened, and the heating that has happened so far, Siddharth, is only 1.1 degrees centigrade. We have only seen 1.1 degrees centigrade of warming. We have another 1.7 to go till we get to 2.8. So if we are seeing extreme weather now, imagine what it's going to be like in the future.
And this has also meant, Mr. Sinha, and that takes us to our next slide, that heat waves have become more recurrent in this country. And just 2 examples that perhaps capture the gravity of the situation we face is the land surface temperatures reaching 65 degrees Celsius in Gujarat, and this is 2022. Air temperatures touching 46 degrees in Rajasthan. We're still at the beginning of the summer this year. It might actually get worse as we go forward.
Last year, Siddharth, we had the warmest April and May on record. So we have 122 years of record keeping on temperatures. And in April or May of last year, we had these very, very scary heat waves, which meant that our April and May were the warmest they ever were. We reached land temperatures of 65 degrees centigrade in Gujarat, air temperatures of 46 degrees centigrade. We are getting to the point where it's becoming unlivable with these heat waves, and that's the kind of impact that these heat waves are beginning to have. And this is, again, I will remind you, Siddharth, this is with 1.1 degrees centigrade. What will happen when we get to 2.8 degrees centigrade? What kind of heat waves are we going to have? I can tell you climate scientists and public health experts are very, very worried about the impact of this kind of extreme heat on South Asia. South Asia is going to be the most affected because the combination of what is called heat and humidity, which is wet bulb temperature, the combination of heat and humidity in South Asia is the most dangerous anywhere in the world.
You mentioned South Asia. Let's actually look at what happened to our neighbor Pakistan in August 2022. And almost a third of the country, Mr. Sinha, was underwater due to catastrophic floods. There was massive loss of both life as well as livelihood. And this is just an indication of what might happen if the situation is not addressed with greater political will, more proactive approach.
So that a lot of people think that climate change is about the future. It's science fiction. We have to worry about it 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. The reality is that the impact of global warming, the impact of climate change is affecting us today. What happened last year in Pakistan? As I told you, we had the warmest April and May in recorded history last year. What people had not anticipated is that when you have that kind of warming in April and May, you are going to see glacial melting. So we got this incredible glacial melting in April and May, so that the Himalayan glaciers started to melt very fast. When they melted very fast, the Indus River, which of course runs through Pakistan, as you know, was full of water because of glacial melting. And then we had something that had never been seen before. Sindh and Balochistan, which don't get much rainfall, got 5 times the normal rainfall that they normally do. The net result of it was that a third of Pakistan, with the glacial melting and the extreme rainfall, got flooding.
With respect to the implications that this also has on food shortages, leading to hunger and malnourishment as well. We're seeing that in the African continent, especially sub-Saharan Africa.
Climate change is now, which is what I just said, Siddharth. We are dealing with climate change just now. Drought is affecting all these countries in the Horn of Africa. We are dealing with epic hunger problems there, and that is something we are going to have to deal with everywhere in the world.
And Mr. Sinha, this is a cyclical process. In fact, if you could just pan to the next slide, this is a cyclical process with several trigger points in this particular cycle, which end up acting as catalysts in trying to kind of exacerbate this entire situation that we face with respect to climate change. If you could actually explain certain tipping points as to how this process actually gets vitiated even further.
Very true, Siddharth. The fact is, the reason why the Paris Agreement selected 1.5 degrees centigrade, worst case 2 degrees centigrade, as really the ceiling that we need to get to, is because we don't know what's going to happen when we reach some of these trigger points. We could be in a situation when we get to more than 2 degree warming that we get to cataclysmic climate change, right? As we saw in Pakistan, for example, or we are seeing in the Horn of Africa, we could get to cataclysmic climate change, and right now we are not at 2 degrees, we are going to 2.8 degrees, right? So we are actually on track for something pretty cataclysmic, and that is because there are various things. Glacial melting we've already spoken about, but the Arctic and the Antarctic ice sheets are melting.
Yes.
And we've heard about polar bears not having a place to live any longer because the ice sheets are melting in the Arctic and the Antarctic. But if the Arctic and the Antarctic melt, we'll get a lot more water that's going to create coastal flooding and so on. The coral reefs are going to die off, currents can collapse, and as it gets warmer, the permafrost, which is in the Siberian tundra, that can start to release methane gas. So the interaction of these climate tipping points is something that climate scientists cannot even model right now. They can't even predict what's going to happen. And so we're very worried, and we want insurance.
Yes.
That's what we need. The 2 degrees centigrade, the 1.5 degrees centigrade, Siddharth, is insurance against cataclysmic climate change, which is where we will be if we start to exceed 2 degrees centigrade.
You've explained to us now the depth of the problem we face, the intensity of the problem we face. Let's deliberate over what steps can actually be taken to ensure that we're in a better position in 2070. So if we can come to the next slide that explains to us what net zero might actually entail for the future of our economy and also our general well-being.
So let's go from all of the worries and all of the concerns we have about climate change, about getting to net zero, and let's now look at the opportunity, not just the threat, because of course there is a threat, but let's look at the opportunity that it presents. And in fact, this is a very exciting story. The really important part of this is that net zero is actually net positive. And if we can get to net zero, as the Honourable Prime Minister has said, by 2070, it'll be a fantastic thing for India. Why? Today, as you know, air pollution is a huge problem. All of us in Delhi are worried about the gas chamber effect here in Delhi. We can address air pollution. We can have higher GDP growth. We want a $10 trillion economy. We want a $20 trillion economy. Well, guess what? If we pursue net zero, we'll get there faster. We'll create more jobs, which is what we want. And we will be able to get more Atmanirbharta, we will be more self-reliant, because we in India get a lot of solar radiation, and so we can use the sun to power our economy and not have to import fossil fuels. So net zero is net positive for India. It's fantastically good for us, for our growth, and we really need to emphasize that.
And the next slide, of course, will explain the phenomenon of decarbonization, what we actually need to do in terms of certain policy steps in order to achieve fewer carbon emissions. So if you can just take us through some details there.
So Siddharth, the good news is that with the Honourable Prime Minister having said that we have to get to net zero by 2070, we are actually following now in India a net zero developmental model. Okay. In India, we are following a net zero model, and that net zero model has 4 very important parts, each of which we are pushing very, very hard. Number 1, renewables, right? So we want an electricity grid, we want a power system that's driven by solar and wind. The Honourable Prime Minister has given an announcement of 500 gigawatts of solar, of largely moving towards renewable energy, and we are really, really doing that. That's really, really good. Number 2, we want to go to 100% electric vehicles, and that's happening. As you go around Delhi, you will see electric cabs everywhere in Delhi. People are buying electric two-wheelers. Large number of three-wheelers, auto rickshaws have moved to electric because electric is actually cheaper. The cost, Siddharth, and this will surprise you, the cost of an electric rickshaw, three-wheeler, is 50 paisa per kilometer. The cost of a petrol three-wheeler is 5 rupees per kilometer. So it's much cheaper to use electric transportation, provided the grid has gone to renewables. It's much cheaper to and much better to go to electric. And we are going to electric very, very fast. Then, of course, and again, the Honourable Prime Minister has announced a national hydrogen mission, biofuels. We are moving towards that very, very quickly. And now with the legislation that has recently been passed on carbon markets, in India, we have the framework for creating a carbon market. We've got to integrate it globally so that wherever we reduce carbon, we get the benefits of that, and we have global funds that provide us the resources for doing it.
So what's our GDP going to look like if we end up embracing a lot of these initiatives that have been planned? Those are the figures that you see on your screen. It's a win-win, like you said, in the event this actually materializes.
Exactly right. And that's why we are working so hard to try and get the financing and the technology from the global north. If indeed we are able to get those trillions of dollars flowing into India from the developed countries, we are actually going to see that our GDP grows faster, right? So our GDP is going to increase much faster, 2%, 3% faster, if we in fact are able to attract those trillions of dollars. If we pursue a net zero model, a net zero decarbonization pathway, actually a GDP is going to grow faster than it would if we stayed with what we have right now.
And it will also aid the process of job creation, which brings us to the next set of figures, because unemployment still continues to be a pressing problem, but we're looking at a possible scenario where this can actually be an engine to create more jobs in this country.
The Honourable Prime Minister and the Honourable Finance Minister have been emphasizing that if we are pursuing net zero, we are going to create lots of green jobs. And you can see that one of the pillars of the budget this time was green growth, because the Honourable Prime Minister and Finance Minister understand very well that if we can attract investments into the green industries that I spoke about earlier, we're going to create lots and lots of incremental, high-quality jobs that will position India very well at what I call the green frontier. The frontier where we are both competitive and we are sustainable. That is the green frontier, which creates lots and lots of high quality technology jobs.
You spoke about the serious health implications of global warming and the number of premature deaths that we're likely to preempt in the event that we embrace certain initiatives is there for all to see. And if you could just take our viewers through the implications of embracing a greener energy kind of a blueprint, what are we actually looking at in terms of the lives that will be saved as a result of that?
Sadly, Siddharth, Delhi is a gas chamber because we are pumping so much pollution into the air from the vehicles that we have, from the coal that we are burning and so on. And if we switch to clean, green energy, what we are going to do is we are going to save millions and millions of lives cumulatively, much more than from COVID. So today the estimates from the WHO and other medical institutions is that between 1 to 2 million lives, 10 to 20 lakh people a year are dying from air pollution. That's much more than COVID. We are losing more people to air pollution than we've lost from COVID every year. So if we can cut down on fossil fuels, then we can save all those lives because we are not pumping all of that pollution into the air. And that gas chamber effect on Delhi and our cities will diminish dramatically if we start to use clean, green vehicles. And that's why the lives saved here are a huge component of why net zero is net positive.
You also talked about the impact that this could have on balance of payments, and that brings us to our next chart, where, of course, as a result of a reduction in imports, we also end up enhancing our own energy security. There are questions being raised as to whether or not India will actually have to do a lot more in terms of the money that it spends internally to achieve this objective. You yourself spoken about the need to spend an additional $100 to $150 billion each year in order to meet this objective.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you can see from that chart, the reference scenario, which is where we are today, we are importing about $250 billion a year of fossil fuels. We have an import bill of $600 billion approximately. Of that $600 billion, about $250 billion is fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, which we're importing from around the world. If indeed we go to the net zero 2070 scenario, we are going to save hundreds of billions of dollars a year in terms of fossil fuel imports. That will strengthen our energy security. We'll be creating those jobs here in India, not outside India.
And finally, of course, we come to a summation of pretty much everything that we've discussed so far. You've described as to why more proactive climate action is a win-win for all. If you could just sum it up for our viewers as well.
Thank you, Siddharth. And I want to end here by saying once again, net zero is net positive. But it's not just net positive for the planet. Of course, it's net positive for the planet. The planet does not warm as much right now. We are headed towards 2.8 degrees centigrade. We want to keep it to 1.52 degrees centigrade. We protect the ecosystem. We are losing a lot of biodiversity because forests and others are being cut down. Fewer radical measures will be required. It's a win. It's a huge win for the planet. But it's a huge win for the global north as well. Global north, of course, is protected from climate change, but their industries grow, they create jobs, their investors get good returns. So the north wins. And of course, we in the south win because, as I said, net zero is positive for GDP, it's positive for jobs, it's positive for air pollution, it's positive for our balance of payments and our energy security.
Well, Mr. Sinha, that was very comprehensive indeed, lots of food for thought. And more power to you in increasing awareness about the threat of climate change as well as global warming. Perhaps this will inject greater energy across the world in not just creating awareness about this, but actually doing something more proactive to ensure that we meet our targets that we've set for 2070, but also the fact that the world is a far more secure place a generation down the line, if not at the point that we're currently speaking right now. So that awareness is necessary, but also, of course, proactive involvement at the individual level as well. So thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you, Siddharth. And let's do it for all of you and for my children and grandchildren.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us on this special edition of Inside.